What if I told you the United States is losing its grip on global trade, and fast? France has just made a shocking move that even the European Union didn't see coming, and now other countries are following suit. In response to US tariffs, France has hit back with countermeasures that could shake the global automotive and manufacturing industries. But it doesn't stop there. Mexico, Canada, India, and even the BRICS nations are shifting their trade strategies, potentially leaving the United States economically isolated. These decisions will affect everything from car prices to job markets and global supply chains. The question is the United States prepared for this new reality? Stick around, because we're breaking down the biggest trade shifts happening right now. Who wins, who loses, and what it means for the future of the global economy. Let's dive in. What's happening? Trade wars have always been unpredictable, but no one expected France to retaliate this quickly against the United States. The US government under President Trump imposed a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum imports, claiming it was necessary to protect American manufacturers. However, what followed caught Washington off guard. France, along with the broader European Union, wasted no time in responding. French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot made it clear that France would not remain passive while its industry suffered. Within days of the announcement, France proposed countermeasures targeting key American exports that would hit the US economy hard. These retaliatory tariffs were designed to offset economic losses while making a statement France would not be bullied into submission. But the impact of these tariffs went far beyond just diplomatic retaliation. They had immediate and severe consequences for the automotive sector. The automobile industry is one of the largest consumers of steel and aluminum, and with raw material prices surging due to the US tariffs, automakers across France, Germany, and Italy began scrambling to find alternative suppliers. For major French automakers like Renault and Peugeot, this sudden increase in costs put tremendous pressure on production expenses. Higher steel and aluminum prices meant higher vehicle prices, which could make European cars less competitive in global markets. The ripple effect of this move didn't stop at automakers. It extended to hundreds of thousands of workers in industries reliant on these materials. But France's response wasn't just about tariffs. It was about sending a message to the US and the world. Economic warfare would not go unanswered. But why did the US take this risk in the first place? To understand that, we need to look at the bigger picture behind Trump's economic strategy. Trump's protectionist policies. To many, President Trump's decision to impose tariffs on steel and aluminum seemed like an aggressive unilateral move, but in reality, it was part of a larger protectionist strategy that had been in the works for years. The logic behind these tariffs was simple. By raising the cost of foreign steel and aluminum, the US government believed it could revive domestic manufacturing. The goal was to incentivize American companies to source materials locally, thus creating jobs and strengthening the economy. On paper, this seemed like a logical move. Why rely on foreign metals when the US could produce its own? However, what many economists warned about became reality almost immediately. Tariffs rarely come without consequences. France wasn't the first country to push back against US trade policies. Canada, Mexico, and even China had already engaged in economic conflicts with Washington due to similar policies in the past. In fact, the US and China had been locked in a prolonged trade war for several years, with tariffs on everything from electronics to agricultural products disrupting global markets. The biggest risk with Trump's protectionist policies was that they often alienated allies instead of just competitors. Unlike previous economic disputes, which were largely between the US and China, this latest trade war targeted some of Washington's closest partners, including the European Union, Canada, and Japan. This created tensions within the Western Alliance at a time when economic cooperation was more important than ever. As the trade war escalated, the European Union had to make a decision. Should it negotiate a compromise with the US, or should it strike back with its own economic weapons? The European Union didn't hesitate. Instead of backing down, it decided to unite against US policies, creating a new front in the trade war. The European Union's response, a united front. France wasn't the only European country feeling the heat from US tariffs. Germany, Italy, and Spain were also on high alert. As soon as Washington announced its new tariff strategy, leaders across the European Union began preparing their response. At the center of the European retaliation was President Emmanuel Macron, who took a firm stance against what he called unfair trade practices. He was quickly backed by Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz and Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, both of whom recognized that these tariffs could destabilize Europe's industrial economy. In response, the European Commission began discussing countermeasures, including new tariffs on American-made vehicles, agricultural products, and technology exports. This move wasn't just about retaliation, it was about economic survival. If the US was going to make European imports more expensive, then Europe would do the same with American exports. One of the biggest concerns for German and French automakers was how these tariffs would disrupt supply chains. European car companies rely heavily on imported American parts, including engines, software, and electronic components. If the trade war escalated further, it could force European manufacturers to seek alternative suppliers, or worse, slow down production altogether. The European Union's stance was clear. They were ready to fight back, but would the US economy feel the consequences of its own decisions? The answer to that question became obvious when US automakers started feeling the pressure, and for companies like Ford, General Motors, and Tesla, the stakes couldn't be higher. American automakers in trouble. As tensions between the US and France escalated, American automakers quickly realized they were caught in the crossfire. While Washington's goal was to protect domestic industries, the reality was that automobile manufacturers were among the hardest hit by these new tariffs. For companies like Ford and General Motors, the cost of steel and aluminum skyrocketed, making vehicle production significantly more expensive. Many factories in the US still rely on imported raw materials, meaning they had no immediate way to offset these rising costs. The result? Higher prices for American-made vehicles, something that could drive customers toward foreign competitors. Even Tesla, which prides itself on domestic production, wasn't immune. The company sources many of its battery materials and components from international suppliers, particularly from China and Europe. With trade tensions rising, Tesla faced supply chain disruptions, which could delay production and delivery of vehicles, something CEO Elon Musk was desperate to avoid. But the biggest fear looming over the US auto industry wasn't just higher prices, it was losing its competitive edge on the global stage. If France and the European Union forged stronger trade deals with China, India, or Japan, it could mean that European automakers would gain greater market access, while US companies struggled with diminishing export opportunities. The trade war had started as an attempt to revitalize American manufacturing, but in reality, it was pushing the US auto industry into a corner. But France wasn't just relying on retaliatory tariffs. It had another strategy in mind, and this one involved a surprising new alliance with China. The China factor, a strategic shift. For decades, the economic relationship between the United States and its European allies shaped global trade, but now that dynamic is shifting in ways Washington never anticipated. France has been at the forefront of this change, pivoting towards an unlikely partner, China. This move is not just a reaction to US tariffs, it is a long-term strategy that could reshape the global automotive landscape. At the center of this transformation is President Emmanuel Macron's visit to Beijing, a diplomatic mission that resulted in an unprecedented trade agreement. In 2023 alone, trade between France and China surged to an astonishing $78.9 billion, marking a nearly 800-fold increase over 6 decades. The agreement signed during this visit spanned multiple industries, but the most significant involved automotive technology and raw material supply chains. China's grip on electric vehicle battery production is unmatched. The country dominates the supply of lithium, cobalt, and nickel, materials that are essential for EV production. With global demand for electric vehicles soaring, France sees an opportunity to secure a long-term supply of these critical resources without relying on the United States. By deepening ties with Beijing, French automakers could gain an edge over competitors who remain dependent on traditional supply routes. The message is clear. France is not just looking for a way to survive the trade war, it is positioning itself for dominance in the next era of automotive manufacturing. But with every strategic move comes risk, and this one could have consequences that stretch far beyond trade deals. But if France, and by extension the European Union, chooses China as its primary EV partner, the US could find itself sidelined. With France and China forging closer ties, the United States is being forced to respond. The question is, how far will Washington go to stop this shift? US retaliation. The moment France's China pivot became public, alarms went off in Washington. The US had already taken a hard stance against China's dominance in the electric vehicle industry, imposing tariffs and restrictions to curb its influence. But now, a key ally was actively strengthening ties with Beijing, and that posed a serious challenge to American trade policy. In response, US officials began exploring countermeasures. Some of the proposals included sanctions on French-Chinese joint ventures, increased tariffs on European cars with Chinese-made components, and potential trade penalties against any automaker relying heavily on Chinese battery supplies. The fear in Washington is that if France succeeds in creating a stable EV supply chain with China, other European nations will follow. This would weaken America's influence over global auto markets and erode its ability to dictate trade rules in the electric vehicle sector. The stakes are even higher for US automakers, who are already struggling to compete in an increasingly competitive global market. If Europe fully commits to Chinese EV technology, it could make American-made electric vehicles less attractive to international consumers. With rising production costs and limited access to raw materials, American manufacturers could see their market share shrink dramatically. While US automakers are already facing pressure, no company is feeling the impact of these global shifts more than Tesla. Tesla's global dilemma. For years, Tesla has been the undisputed leader in electric vehicles, pioneering innovation and setting new industry standards. But now, the company finds itself caught in the middle of a global trade war, one that could threaten its future. Tesla's entire business model relies on global supply chains. It sources raw materials from multiple countries, manufactures in several regions, and sells vehicles to a worldwide market. But as trade tensions escalate, Tesla faces rising costs, increased tariffs, and supply chain disruptions that could jeopardize its competitive edge. The company has already been forced to adjust its strategies to navigate these challenges. Tesla's factory in Shanghai, which produces a significant portion of its global EV supply, is now a point of concern for US policymakers. If the US imposes stricter trade regulations on Chinese-made EVs, Tesla could face higher export costs and potential restrictions on certain battery components. At the same time, Tesla is dealing with increasing competition from both European and Chinese automakers. Companies like BYD, NIO, and XPeng are rapidly expanding, offering high-quality electric vehicles at competitive prices. If Tesla struggles to adapt to shifting trade policies, it could lose its dominant position in the global EV market. The bigger question is whether Tesla will continue playing both sides, maintaining operations in China while trying to navigate US trade restrictions. If the company cannot find a balance, it risks being squeezed out of key markets, leaving room for competitors to take over. As the US and France clash, the entire European Union is feeling the shockwaves. Europe's auto industry under siege. The European auto industry has long been a global powerhouse, but the latest US tariffs on steel and aluminum have sent shockwaves through the sector. Major automakers like BMW, Volkswagen, Renault, and Peugeot are now facing one of the biggest production crises in modern history. The cost of raw materials is skyrocketing, and with global supply chains already fragile from previous trade disputes, European manufacturers are being forced to adapt or risk losing their competitive edge. Steel and aluminum are the backbone of the automotive industry. Every vehicle requires massive quantities of these materials, from body frames to engine components. But with tariffs driving up costs by as much as 25%, the financial strain is becoming unbearable. Companies are now scrambling to find alternative suppliers, renegotiate contracts, or even relocate production outside of Europe. For consumers, this could mean higher car prices across the board. A vehicle that once cost the equivalent of $30,000 may now be several $1,000s more expensive simply due to rising material costs. This is not just about business. It is about affordability for millions of car buyers across Europe and beyond. But the biggest question remains, can Europe's auto giants find a way to stay competitive in an increasingly hostile trade environment? Some companies are already looking to China and other Asian markets to secure cheaper materials, but that could mean a shift away from traditional European suppliers. But it is not just rising costs that are shaking up the industry. Tariffs are causing massive disruptions to global supply chains, creating a ripple effect across the entire economy. Supply chains in crisis. A car is not built in one place. It is the result of a complex global supply chain that spans multiple countries and continents. From raw materials to electronics, each component must be sourced, transported, and assembled with precision. But tariffs on steel, aluminum, and other essential materials have disrupted this delicate system, leaving automakers in crisis mode. One of the biggest challenges is the interruption of transatlantic trade routes. Many European automakers rely on American parts and materials, just as American companies depend on European suppliers. But now, with tariffs and counter-tariffs in place, moving goods between continents has become an expensive and complicated ordeal. Some manufacturers are considering a radical shift, moving production outside of Europe entirely. Setting up factories in Asia, South America, or even parts of Africa could help companies avoid US tariffs while maintaining access to raw materials. However, such a move is easier said than done. Relocating production means billions of dollars in investments, new labor contracts, and re-establishing supplier relationships from scratch. In response to this crisis, European governments are stepping in. There is now a race to secure subsidies and incentives that will help automakers absorb costs and keep production within Europe. Germany and France are leading the charge, offering tax breaks, low-interest loans, and grants to ensure that major manufacturers do not flee to cheaper markets. But will it be enough? If these disruptions continue, we could see a fundamental reshaping of the global auto industry, one where traditional manufacturing hubs lose their dominance. With so much at stake, both the US and the European Union now face a critical decision. Will they de-escalate tensions and renegotiate a trade deal, or will the divide grow even deeper? Can US-EU trade relations be saved? Diplomatic ties between the United States and the European Union have never been this strained in recent history. Once seen as strong allies with deep economic partnerships, the relationship is now on the brink of a full-scale trade war. The big question, can this be reversed before it is too late? On one side, Washington insists that these tariffs are necessary to protect American manufacturers and reduce reliance on foreign trade. But on the other, European leaders argue that these policies are damaging industries on both sides of the Atlantic. This is where global trade organizations like the World Trade Organization and the Group of Seven come into play. Both groups are designed to mediate trade disputes, but in recent years, their influence has weakened. If the WTO fails to step in and broker an agreement, we could see a shift away from traditional trade governance toward more fragmented economic blocs. Behind the scenes, diplomats from Brussels and Washington are scrambling to find common ground. Some officials are proposing temporary tariff rollbacks, while others are pushing for a more permanent agreement that would exempt critical industries like automotive manufacturing from further trade restrictions. But there is another major challenge: political pressure in both regions. In the United States, domestic manufacturers and labor unions are demanding that tariffs stay in place to protect American jobs. In Europe, automakers are calling for urgent relief, warning that if the US does not ease restrictions, thousands of jobs could be lost. Ultimately, the fate of US-EU trade relations depends on whether both sides are willing to make concessions. If a compromise cannot be reached, the economic consequences could be long-lasting, and the US may find itself facing a much larger problem, because while Washington is focused on its standoff with Europe, the rest of the world is moving ahead, and the US risks being left behind. A new trade order. For decades, the United States has been at the center of global trade. Its economic power shaped alliances, dictated policies, and influenced industries worldwide. But today, that dominance is being challenged like never before. The US tariffs on European goods are not just about trade, they are about control. By imposing restrictions, Washington is trying to force allies into submission. But instead of backing down, countries like France, Germany, and even Canada are seeking new alliances that reduce their reliance on the US economy. China is the biggest winner in this shift. As European nations explore alternative trade partners, Beijing is stepping in with open arms. The Chinese government has increased investments in European infrastructure, secured major supply contracts, and positioned itself as a key player in the global auto industry. This means that while the US isolates itself, China is strengthening its hold on global commerce. Germany is also taking a leadership role. As the largest economy in Europe, it is actively working to reshape trade agreements that benefit the European Union while minimizing dependence on US policies. If successful, we could see a new economic order, one where Europe, China, and emerging markets operate independently of US influence. This raises a critical question: could the US become economically isolated if more allies follow France's lead? The answer depends on how Washington responds. If the US continues to push aggressive tariffs, more countries may pivot toward alternative economic blocs. But if American leaders recognize the risks and seek diplomatic solutions, there is still a chance to rebuild trust and restore global partnerships. What happens next could define the future of international trade for decades. Will the US adapt to a new global landscape, or will it cling to outdated economic strategies that leave it behind? And the US may not have much time to decide, because France is not the only country taking a stand. Other nations are now making their own moves against US trade policies, signaling a much bigger shift on the horizon. Mexico and Canada. turning away from US trade. For decades, Mexico and Canada have been deeply tied to the United States through trade agreements like NAFTA, now replaced by the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. However, recent developments suggest both countries are looking beyond the North American trade bloc, exploring stronger economic ties with Europe and Asia. Rising tariffs, protectionist policies, and shifting global dynamics have made diversification an increasingly attractive option for these two key US trade partners. Mexico, in particular, has been strengthening economic relations with China, aiming to reduce its reliance on US imports. The country is also exploring new trade routes with European nations, especially in the automotive and manufacturing sectors. With China's growing presence in Latin America, Mexico has positioned itself as a key player in bridging Asian and Western markets. Meanwhile, Canada has also expanded its trade agreements with Europe through CETA and is working on strengthening economic relations with Asian markets, particularly Japan and South Korea. Could Mexico and Canada follow France's strategy of economic diversification? The answer seems to be unfolding right now. While the US remains their biggest trade partner, the growing economic uncertainty has pushed them to look at long-term alternatives. A shift away from US-centric trade would not only impact the North American economy, but also reshape supply chains on a global scale. India's quiet shift. India has long balanced its trade relations between major global powers, but recent geopolitical shifts have accelerated its pivot towards Europe and China. Traditionally, India has had strong economic ties with the United States, but recent US policies, including tariffs and restrictive trade agreements, have prompted India to explore other options. One of the most significant developments is the emerging India-Europe trade corridor. Through strategic agreements with the European Union, India is enhancing its exports of technology, pharmaceuticals, and automotive components to European markets. In return, European businesses are investing heavily in India's infrastructure and manufacturing sectors. This growing partnership aims to create an alternative trade route that bypasses US-dominated supply chains. At the same time, India has strengthened its ties with China despite geopolitical tensions. China remains India's largest trading partner, and both countries have been engaging in economic collaboration in sectors like renewable energy, telecommunications, and electronics manufacturing. By diversifying its trade relationships, India is reducing its dependence on any single economic power, following a strategy similar to France's approach in balancing trade between major blocs. As India strengthens its ties with Europe and China, a much larger economic bloc is working to challenge US dominance on a global scale. The BRICS Challenge. In recent years, their efforts to reduce reliance on the US dollar and establish independent trade networks have gained momentum. This movement represents one of the most significant threats to US economic influence. China and Russia are at the forefront of this initiative, advocating for alternative global financial institutions that bypass traditional Western control. The establishment of the New Development Bank by BRICS is an example of their commitment to reducing dependence on US-led organizations like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. The shift away from dollar-based trade settlements is another key element, with multiple BRICS nations exploring the use of local currencies and digital payment systems. The growing trade alliances between BRICS members and other developing economies are reshaping global commerce. Brazil has expanded trade with China and India, focusing on agricultural exports and energy resources. South Africa has strengthened its economic ties with Asian markets, ensuring diversified trade partnerships beyond the Western sphere. Could BRICS become a real threat to US economic leadership? If these nations continue to expand their cooperation, they could create a parallel global economic order, challenging US dominance in trade and finance. This could accelerate the shift towards a multipolar world where power is distributed more evenly among different economic blocs. Now, we want to hear from you. Do you think the United States should adjust its trade policies to counter these emerging alliances? Will the BRICS nations, Canada, or India become dominant players in global trade? Or is this just a short-term shift that the United States can recover from? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your opinion matters, and we're eager to hear what you think about the future of international trade. And if you want to stay ahead of the latest updates in the automotive and trade industries, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel.